Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome to Shelf Stories, the channel that tells tales from games, books, and life. I'm your host, Jason. Thank you so much for stopping by for this latest episode of Good Trouble, where I talk about culture stuff in the spirit of education and compassion. So this video follows up on a shorter reflection that I did a couple days ago. I had a lot going on in my mind, so I sat down on a stoop, fired up the phone, and did a short reflection on the topic of the fear of white replacement. Oh man, big spicy meatball of a discussion. And, some back and forth was had, people who agreed and disagreed. And as always, I appreciate my audience for engaging and sharing their thoughts. The topic itself, though, I thought warranted something more than just a quick reflection. It is so important, so central to explaining how much, friction and trouble and culture war and all we have. So I've known this. I've read about it and, talked about it. Those of us in the discourse have been dealing with this for years. We're having a moment, culturally where, right there in the manifesto of a shooter in Buffalo who's targeting people for the color of skin, talked about on, the major medias and Twitters and all that kind of thing. So I wanted to match the moment and help people understand this concept doesn't come out of nowhere. It is a long-standing thing. So here I am, Good Trouble style. You're going to get the graphics. You're going to get the whole rolling thing. And I apologize to my my watchers. My graphics game is just not evolved. 18 months in, I'm just not a graphics guy, not my jam. But I hope that what I do have to offer is of use to people. Wanted to thank somebody. I want to thank Cameron Hayes. He is a good friend at this point. He and I are working on a creative project together. At some point, I hope to be able to share it with y'all. He shared with me a teaching tool called the White Replacement Pyramid. And what I resonated with was it goes through a lot of the stuff that I talk about, but it puts it in levels, right? It makes it clear that there's a whole bunch of different levels to this stuff. And in particular, the thesis of the last video was that you have the overt stuff, the explosions of violence and all the kind of things that we really don't like to see, but it is built upon a whole structure. Think of an iceberg style. You have the tip that you see, but then the whole submerged part that you don't see. And so I figured I would do it shelf story style. There's the overt and the covert. How do they relate? That's what I'm going to go through in my video. But before I get to the rest of the conversation, I want to take a half step back and ask why. Why am I doing this? I think it's really important that I share that this isn't just a head game for me. This is a heart game. I'm sincerely affected by what goes on in the world, and all these videos are not just to discourse and share my education, my prodigious education. I spent a lot of time thinking and reading about this stuff. I truly want to solve a problem. We have a problem with violence. We have a problem with exclusion. These big things that I just said are, these explosions that seem to come out of nowhere. And my sincere conviction, heartfelt conviction, is that the seeds of this stuff happen in our communities. I happen to be in board gaming. That happens to be my primary community where I relate to other folks. It doesn't have to be. Any community can have this stuff. I could have been in knitting. I could have been in race car driving. I could be at the local Order of Masons or some neighborhood group. Anywhere where there are humans interacting, we can get these little issues that slowly, if unaddressed, grow up into these big issues. This is not personal to board gamers. Anyone who's watching this video and feels personally attacked, or I'm drawing with too broad a brush with the words that I use, please know that my sincere intention is to have the honest conversations, not just piss people off for no reason, but honest conversations to get to the point of better community. And I truly believe we have to have difficult conversation. We have to go through the badlands in order to get to the promised land. Can't just assume that we're there. We can't just say, okay, if we just stop talking about it, then things will be healed. That is not something I believe in. So you may buy that, you may not, but know that that is my intention going in. If you support that, if you support my good intentions, or you happen to like the execution of the video and you think I bring community and education and compassion, all the things that I try to do, if you think I'm successful at that, The best way you can support me is like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it out. I appreciate every single person who shares one of my videos or says, this creator makes me happy, like on a Twitter thread or something. That makes me really, really warm and fuzzy inside. So I will not monetize this space. I am a believer that advertisement is just, they jut in there, they kind of distract the issue. I don't want to bring any of that baggage to these videos. So the best way you can support is just liking and sharing. Really appreciate it. So let's start at the top of the pyramid and work our way down. I'm going to borrow from the source material pretty explicitly, and then as we get into the lower half, I'm going to add my own insights. So this is hate. I think we can all agree. At the very top is the worst thing that can happen to a people's genocide, mass murder. The thing that got me going and in this particular line of thinking was hearing about the shooting in Buffalo. A man, a white supremacist, teenager, 18 years old, declaring his hatred of black folks and acting upon it to the point, and I'm not sure if this is a rumor or whatever, but apparently as he was shooting, he was apologizing to individual white people for getting caught in a crossfire, managed to kill at least 2 of them anyway. So, I think the paradigm has been that this is like a lone wolf type scenario. So, you have the Christchurch shooting and, El Paso at the Walmart, you have, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and all these different incidents of mass murder. And for, if you know your historical background, then it hasn't always been this way. I mean, there's always been genocide and mass murders, but they've been state-sponsored. What we call the Indian Wars were basically a program of genocide. What we refer to as Jim Crow and the things that happened before Tulsa Massacre was genocide. State-sponsored, society-sponsored, just were founded on this stuff. Look up limpieza de sangre. Way back in the 1400s and 1500s, the intellectual justification for genocide. So if we're used to thinking about it in this lone wolf paradigm right now, then please get to know your history. This is a constant in the enforcement of hierarchy. So a watcher might be asking themselves at this point, why am I focusing on white supremacist violence? What about other groups? Doesn't every group perpetuate political violence at some level? Check the stats. I'm showing some right now from recently, and it goes back through the history. White supremacists and associated ideologies have perpetuated most of the violence. And I don't want to, be racist about this stuff. I don't want to say it's kind of inherent in white skin. My suspicion is that it's a cultural thing. Any group that has the power and has the status has, therefore, the most to lose when change happens, and so there'll be an instinct to fight to keep it. At least it's my theory. And so one level down, you have your perpetrators of individual violence against folks of marginalized background, who, whatever is happening, they have justified it in their heads, that they are not doing anything wrong. In fact, they're right somehow to enforce their vision of hierarchy. So then you have your bad apple cops, you have your scientists and whoever else is in charge in the medical professions or elsewhere that perpetrate this kind of violence. You have people that are deputized or feel deputized by the society to individually enforce hierarchy. And, you have all sorts of just garden variety bullies that I think if anybody of a marginalized background, especially if you're from a poor background, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. So beyond that, there's level 3, which I'm calling calls to action. So those first 2 levels are actions of the most hateful kind. That third level are the calls to such actions that promote hierarchy enforcement. So, you have your calls to people who are like-minded to gather into societies like the KKK, etc. You have your rallies, you have your manifestos, which are literal calls that, say what the person believes and what they're going to do about it. And all these, perpetrators of violence, not all of them, but a significant amount of them seem to have this need to share. So I got a very, very small taste of that kind of treatment in my comment section on the last video. This is America, built by Anglo-Saxon people, driven by a pioneering spirit and ingenious minds. We are entitled to every inch of this land as God promised it to us. This is our manifest destiny, or perhaps our destiny manifested, no, realized. you don't like it here, go live somewhere else and never return. This land is for the Saxon. As soon as I saw it, screenshot, delete, block, things that you need to do to keep yourself safe on the internet. Shared it on my social medias without sharing the name. People had different responses to it. Some people were remarking on the historical reading there or misreading. Some people were remarking on the possible, what's going on with the person who wrote the thing. To me, the most important thing I wanted to communicate was that this is a threat, a call to action on my part. Well, love it or leave it or whatever it is, and then etc. My wife, looks at the thing, looks at the comment, and first thing she does is she turns to me and she says, do we need to up our security in our home? Do you think it's a good idea to keep making culture videos, Jason? And to me, this is exactly the reason why I need to keep making culture videos. This is out there. And I think it's as negligent to just ignore it and move on. And so in response, I got the advice like, well, you put out a video that has this provocative title, Fear of Right Replacement. You provoked it. And if you don't want it, then don't put out these big old provocative things. Be more constructive, be more kind. Don't just provoke people. Well, it's out there. And if it wasn't going to get provoked by my attempt to have a direct, honest conversation, then who say that it wasn't going to get provoked somewhere else in someone else's feed when they're being perfectly nice? Matter of fact, a lot of people who just there doing perfectly nice things and terrible crap happens to them anyway. So I am not down with any advice that echoes this idea of comply or die. Leave well enough alone and you'll be left alone. As we see with these top two levels of violence, no matter what we do, this is liable to happen, and we need to talk about it and ultimately try to do our best about it. So before I go on to the rest of the period, I want to flesh out one little thing with the calls to action section, which is the toxic slurs. I put them on here because what makes particular slurs toxic are that they are calls to action. The N-word, the words that different marginalized groups have in the history, and in our case in America, we're talking hundreds of years of history. Use of that word almost always was followed by some kind of violent action or exclusion or something truly materially negative followed. So this is against what some people think, well, it's just a word. Why are we so afraid of words? Even some of the most influential comics that I have followed throughout the years, the George Collins, the Lenny Bruces, they have a whole bits. That's like, oh, well, we put all this meaning on the word, and why are we so trapped in that kind of stuff, blah, 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 blah. And check history, check human psychology. There are just some slurs that immediately have that sense of a call to action. And well, that means that those words they almost disqualify themselves because of what the weight, the historical and material and psychological weight they have. So there are people who are, lots of white folks. They know exactly what I'm talking about, but they refer to it in terms of their own word against them. Racist. People don't like being called racist. Why? Because it carries with it a call to action. Call someone racist. What comes right after? Blame, shame, social violence. So folks understand this concept. Even people who are like, what's the big deal about, the N-word or the different words? Well, there's certain things you don't want to be called either. So let's make a deal and just cut that nonsense out. I've never called any individual a racist in this show, and I never will. So I encourage folks on the other side that are thinking the other side to consider the same when it comes to these words that other groups say are no-fly zones. So that's the deal with overt racism. You see, I have the deal with the little pyramid on top, the obvious stuff, the tip of the iceberg that everybody can see, actions driven by hatred and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now I have a line separating. That indicates that in order to truly understand what's going on, we need to go down, submerge ourselves into the bigger portion of this pyramid that is submerged under and is harder to see. We have the overt stuff, but then we get to the covert stuff. This is can result from intentional acts, but often doesn't. Arises from things like bias, ignorance, and fear. Fear is something I talked about in that last video, and I'm going to get to that when I get to the very bottom of the pyramid. So at this level, though, I want to talk about a reality that has huge material impacts. Discrimination. The thing that we call systemic racism. Much, much harder to see. And I discussed this when I did my video, Follow the Money. In my Real Talk and Racism series, go ahead and check the playlist. I have that available on Shelf Stories. My central definition there was away from talking about racism as interpersonal hatred. Again, that's tippy top stuff. I wanted to shift the conversation to the material theft of resources and the denial of opportunity. And there's all these ways: wealth, housing, education, healthcare, police, that we deny, our society denies, I should say, marginalized folks a proper share of these things. So I don't want to go into it because, again, I said a lot and also backed it up with stats in the last video. But I did want to at least mention a dimension of personal harassment that happens in gaming on a too frequent basis. So personal harassment being, make your alt account and show up in your the person's DMs, person you don't like, usually a POC, usually a woman. If you're a woman POC, God bless you. I don't know how you have stayed in this hobby as long as you have, especially if you have a public forum. So I highlight that as a discrimination thing because what's the effect of most of the actions of a personal harasser? Leave the space, chase them away, deny them opportunity, steal something valuable from them, steal the joy of gaming. So that is a discriminatory act. And I do not discount that sometimes this stuff can rise to the surface. Sometimes people face real material harm. So this is your public service announcement. If you see that happening somewhere in your community, whether it's board game or elsewhere, no tolerance. Delete, block. And that sounds rough. I don't want to delete people. I don't want to block people. Who do you want in your space? Do you want to allow discrimination in your space that pushes folks away who you might want to hang out with? Or do you want to allow that? So let's go on to area number 5. At this point, I'll let folks know that I'm borrowing pretty liberally from the tool that Cameron shared with me. So if you want to Google white supremacist pyramid, go ahead for your own education. I'm going to introduce some changes and innovations of my own for the last 2. This level is called veiled racism. And it's becoming a more and more important level. As society has gone on, it is becoming less and less acceptable to be an overt racist. There used to be a huge section of that pyramid that was visible and people accepted, but the waters are rising and less and less of that point is visible and accepted. That's a great, great thing. And so this veiled racism section becomes more important as a strategy to maintain hierarchy. And it happens in a couple of ways, or whether some people are engaging in it consciously and kind of messing with the plausible deniability spaces intentionally, or the society just produces stuff and people don't even know its real function. So I'll go over both of those areas. So the intentional stuff, the plausible deniability, is just a joke. It's just a frog. It's just an okay symbol. The dog whistles, the strategies that people have used to shitpost and flag to like-minded people that here's some white supremacy stuff going on that isn't understood by just normal workaday folks, and it becomes a strategy to make us look bad, right? So you'll have white supremacists kind of bouncing back and forth their stupidity, and then folks like me will point it out. Hey, wait a minute, that's not a acceptable thing to say or do, or that's very hateful and intolerant. And then the supremacist will go to the normal people and they'll say, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with the okay symbol? What's wrong? They're the racists for telling us and everything. It's a strategy to veil their racism and inflame culture war. You don't believe me? There's a respectable version of this that played very, very famously So this is Lee Atwater, a strategist for the Nixon campaign. You start out in 1954 saying N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, all that stuff. And you're getting abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. I bet some folks didn't know that busing and cutting taxes were actually intentionally veiled forms of racism. Okay, it keeps going. We are dealing with it now with this whole great replacement theory nonsense. It is a intentionally laundered version of the old racist trope of a white America. So it's the current form of it is that, we have these legacy Americans that are displaced by pliant third world voters, and they come in and they're going to get amnesty and they're literally replacing the votes. So what is the material impact of this strategy? It's to gin up a lot of folks to support voter reform and narrowing the field of people who can vote, and on and on and on. So the maddening thing about this is that the material effect affects citizens, people who have been here the whole time. This is aimed a lot in terms of the immigration at Mexicans, but you ask the average Mexican in America, they didn't cross the border crossed them. They've been here longer than the Italians and the Germans and all that kind of thing, but the declaration is that this is a white America and anyone who else is not welcome. Well, that's a lot of political chatter, isn't it? What does that have to do with the board gaming community? A lot. Are there folks who would consider themselves legacy gamers, people who have been here, citizens of the board gaming community, so to speak, for 20, 30, 40 years, where board gaming looked one way and now it feels like it looks a totally different way? It feels like publishers and noteworthy content creators are seeking out different voices and seeking to replace those legacy people, seeking to replace the faces. Great replacement theory has its iterations. There is a reason it resonates in all of these different communities, including board gaming. So we need to consider the context and talk about it. There's a lot more that happens not necessarily intentionally at all, sometimes and often unintentionally, where there's a racist thing that happens and the perceiver doesn't know it and the maker might not even know it. But it happens, it has impact anyway. Whitewashing. The taking of a story, someone's authentic story, where there's violence visited upon them or some kind of historical thing or whatever it is, and washing out all the difficult parts, presenting something that is sanitized and designed for the comfort of folks who are already comfortable in the hierarchy. The whitewashing happens. It is very obvious to us because, hey, look at that conquistador. Look at that statue. Look at that. All these different historical things that we know are difficult, but you have the people on the other side going, what's the problem? You might even have the maker going, what's the problem? Because they didn't learn the history. Well, that is very obvious to people who are familiar with the situation. Tokenism is its own kind of veiled racism. How? The society is made up of a hierarchy and certain people on top and certain people on the bottom. What a token does, it takes one of those people on the bottom, brings them up to the top, does not give them any power. They're only there for visibility. So I could look at a director's board, a CEO, I could look at a publisher, I could look at all these people and they say, hey, look at my diversity. I have so much diversity. I'm progressive and all that kind of stuff. But you look behind the veil, there's no power. The actual centers of power are still where they always were. So that becomes a veiled way of presenting what is a racially instantiated reality. And here's 3 things that I talk about pretty frequently on my channel. Relevant to board gaming. I know, when are you going to get to the gaming? Now I'm going to get very directly to gaming from here on out. This is veiled racism, cultural appropriation, stereotyping, and erasure. Case, my case files, way in which the culture veils racist attitudes or racist histories and makes them very much presentable to a wider audience that don't know what they're looking at. It is completely covered. So you could look at your colonization game. You could look at whatever is there. It doesn't look like anything to people who don't have the right life experience. It's been veiled, erased, taken from somebody else, whatever their strategy is. And we're trying to say something like, wait a minute, that's an issue. Hey, there's no issue, because the veil on these things is pretty strong. So I'm happy to report I've already talked about a lot of this stuff on my channel. I have a whole video on whitewashing and other kinds of washing. I have a series that I'm building on the case files, the appropriations, the stereotypes, and erasures. Please check my channel for further exploration. So now we're down to the final 2 levels. If those first 5 levels are more kind of broad-based societal trends, now we're getting to the nitty-gritty. We're going to go into the Facebook groups, the Reddit groups, the game stores, the game conventions. We're going to look at individual interactions that form community, whether it's on a personal level or a group level. And I'm going to speak specific to my experience in board gaming, but this is, I think, applicable to any community where there's diversity, racial dynamics, all that kind of thing. Most of the time, it is fine. I get the criticism, whoa, you're making all these problems, whatever, you're making board gaming or whoever else look like a flaming hell. Most of the time, it is wonderful. Honestly, even Twitter. I was just reflecting on this. People call Twitter a hellhole, but for the most part, most of the time, it's like a joy to see what people are playing, what new things people have bought. Publishers will announce new things on Kickstarter, or independent creators will reach out and, or we'll not even about games. We're talking about our lives. We're talking about, personal milestones. We're sharing pictures of our pets and our kids and all that kind of thing. Almost all the time, it's wonderful. Then we get to the culture buttons that come up every once in a while. And so that brings me to that 6th level, because when someone like me or someone on, the side or POC or anything like that brings up an issue, and it really doesn't matter the tone. Maybe we come in, fireball blazing. Maybe we come in really nice, wanting to have a discussion. There is a segment of the standing population that I call the pushbackers. These are folks that are normally nice. I can't emphasize that enough. But when animated, it's almost like a paladin suit comes on, and they come in and they want to defend the space pretty proactively. Or even something like, I mentioned this in the previous video where, someone will post, I want to hear about your favorite Black creators, or tell me some games about women, or, we're doing something for API month or something. And it's like, why are we doing that? Why are we, dividing people? Why are we talking about race? Whew. That is the level that I'm talking about. In the original version of the pyramid teaching tool that was shared with me, this is called minimization. And I can think of 2 ways in particular that minimization plays out in this board gaming context. One of them is straight up. It's just a game. What is more minimizing than that? Someone with my perspective, or on the POC side, or whoever else, it could be anyone, points out a problem that they see in a game, and the response is some variation of that. Now, I've gotten, nice, quote unquote, versions of that. Relax and, just enjoy yourself. Do yourself a favor and turn off that critical brain and just enjoy the on the table experience. I've gotten that form of response. Or it could be a little bit more forward and aggressive. It's just a game. Yo, if you're using caps, then it's not just a game, is it? That's because it's just the game is actually a strategy. It is a pushback. It is an attempt to keep the hierarchy going, because the people that feel that way are comfortable in the hierarchy, whether they're conscious of the racial dynamics or they're not. They're just comfortable. They don't want that comfort disrupted for whatever reason. So folks like us we want to point attention to the racial dynamics in the pyramid. Here comes the pushback, the minimizing as a defense mechanism to deflect attention and deflect attempts at disrupting their comfort. Another way in which this minimization pushback plays out is, I don't see race. That one gets employed in response to calls for more different faces on our boxes, different diverse peoples creating content for the games, making the games, publishing the games, etc. And the pushback is, why are we talking about identity? Why are we talking about race and gender, these things that people can't change? We should be emphasizing our common humanity. That is how we get peace. Racial stuff can only divide. And where does that mindset come from? In their reality, racial categories are only up here. It's only the top stuff, only hatred, only the overt racism. So obviously none of us want that. So this is a sincere attempt to remove that part and keep our board gaming space clear of the racial hatred. What is being missed in the I don't see race issue is there's a whole bunch of covert stuff that definitely sees race and organizes according to hierarchy of race. Representation is the antidote to this hierarchical organization. Let us resist every attempt to minimize the importance of representation. So those are some of the ways in which minimization is used in pushback strategies to defend the hierarchy and defend the comfort that is enabled by folks that are comfortable in the hierarchy. So I call that category pushbackers, and I think it's a bigger category, which is why I changed the name. I want to be really careful. I am not accusing anyone who engages in some kind of pushback strategy as a racist. As a matter of fact, having spoken to a lot of folks that would fall into this kind of more combative, argumentative category, I have spoken to them. For the most part, they like diversity. They have POC friends. They're married to POC spouses, children. They work with them, and they're part of their church groups and social groups and everything. The issue that they articulate is with the libs. SJWs, cancel culture. What they want to defend is not, white supremacy, but their idea that we're trying to flip a hierarchy and replace them with our own hierarchy. So the pushback sets in, and as I, in my telling, kind of reinforces a lot of the pyramid. But it's not a diversity thing for them. They think it's a fear thing. It's animated by all sorts of other emotional cues. And I went over this in a video. Look at that. I have a video on all this stuff. I called it reactionary culture. And my thesis in that video was that I think that a lot of the people that are animated are kind of in a distorted mind frame, that they're not quite seeing clearly what folks on my side are really asking for, that we've been judged, we've been labeled, and they think they know what we want. Not quite. And that's why I take so much pains in the video to work through the issues and invite folks to see that we're not trying to just replace the hierarchy. We want something new. But I have one more level to talk about before I get to that something new. The seventh and final level of our pyramid: triggered moderate white folk feelings in response to changes. If you were used to the way things were, then new things are going to kick up feelings. I discussed this in a previous episode with the great Tani Pobeda. The sociological term is moral panic. The larger reality, though, is that there's a whole bunch of feelings that people can experience: bewilderment, confusion, frustration, grievance. Why are things changing? Why do we have to have Black Doctor Who, women Doctor Who? What was wrong with the old Doctor Who's? We have woman Thor. Why do we need? Wasn't the male Thor good enough? I heard one person express it as, well, other groups have their things. Why can't they leave our things alone? And so that is a little bit different from the pushback that I described in the last level. That form is a little bit more aggressive and forward and, kind of more combative. Here, it's just a deeply felt sense of unsettledness. And animating all that is a sense of fear. And fear is what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to pull from almost 2 decades of work in human services and my professional expertise as a psychotherapist here. An almost universal experience, and I've worked with tons of folks. No one wants to lose stuff. No one wants to feel excluded. You go back and understand the history of human evolution. Now, I don't know how you count it, different science and different theories, but it goes way back. For the majority of human history, we've lived in groups, and inclusion in the group meant life, and exclusion from the group meant literal death. And so we live in civilization. We have access to all sorts of different groups, but our brains, they are still operating on the old wiring when exclusion was, at the very least, a very painful and scary experience. And so we bring that to our communities. We bring that to our cities and our families and our workspaces and our hobby spaces. This is a community just like any other. And there are people who really value being here, who get a lot out of being here, and they don't want to lose it. Not just that they don't want to, but it triggers a deep fear inside them that the space is changing, that the demographics are changing, that ways of speaking are changing. Things that were allowed to be said in forums much time ago are no longer allowed to be said in forums. Things just look different, and it is triggering a fear. And for the most part, we have to remember that most people that are online don't speak. And even that most gamers aren't online at all. We're talking millions of gamers that attend conventions and attend different home groups or play games online. We're talking the vast majority of gamers, white gamers, who honestly, from talking with them, they would embrace a new reality. In fact, a lot of them seem excited by the idea. They just want to know that there's a place for them in this new reality. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to show some kindness. I have taken videos to show kindness before, did a whole 40 minutes, kindness, non-judgment, as part of the series that I'm continually referencing here. And let me go ahead and do that again. I'm going to try as best I can to articulate the specific fears that animate that bottom level and see if we could work through some of them in order to begin to wrap around to a way to address and solve this big intractable problem. All right, so I'm going to reflect on some conversations that I've had, use my empathy. I'd be really eager to hear from folks in the comments below. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I understanding the issues? Please feel free to contribute. Okay, so at a surface level, there's a fear that we're going to have fewer games, straight up. There's a lot of games in the crosshair. So, Risk or any other game, a war game where you play a Nazi, or colonization games like Puerto Rico or Catan. You think about it, there's a lot of games that get somebody's hackles up. So if the winds of change blow too hard, we're going to sweep away a bunch of games. We're not going to get adequate ones to replace them, and we're going to be a poor hobby overall. That's a fear. Another one is a fear of being silenced. I glanced at this before. There are some people who are online, but they don't participate. They don't feel they want to participate. Maybe there's too much political noise. It creates kind of a sound wall that pushes people away. They don't want to, engage. Or the conversations are different. They're not the same as what has been had, even a couple of years ago. And so they don't want to say things that are out of turn, ignorant, or invite some kind of reprisal or whatever. I find that a lot of people are conscious that they know what they don't know. And maybe you grew up in an area where it was monocultural and we're having all these multicultural conversations. And so you have a lot of folks that would have something to say, but they kind of don't want to say it. They feel silenced. And if a person is there, but their voice isn't there, then that's going to create a little bit of exclusionary feeling there too. There is a fear that, in this new multicultural world, there's going to be a lack of space for certain people. Certain people could be left behind. I've heard this before. Hey, I'm an American white guy. What culture do I have? That was an online conversation I had with a person from Belgium, and I'm trying to hype it up and say, hey, I would love to learn about, Belgian folklore and Belgian cultural forms and have that in games. And the guy's like, joke's on you. We don't have anything that's worth putting in a game. So if somebody feels that way, then they might feel like in the new world that there won't be a place for them and their experience and their voice. And I got this next one from Rory O'Connor. Thank you very much, Rory, if you made it this far. A fear of irrelevancy as a creator. So I think more than a few are at least dimly aware that they have the opportunities that they have because of white privilege, not because of any inherent quality that they have. They feel like there's other creators that didn't get the chances because of who they are. And if we enter a new space where diversity is emphasized, or if it's overemphasized, which is another fear, that they don't have enough to contribute, to compete in this new space. So there's a fear there on the part of creatives. Are they going to have a role in this new world? There's one last one that I'll talk about in this context. This one's super important. The fear of being judged. In human behavior, judgment precedes exclusion. Someone feels judged, then that is a hop, skip, and a jump away from being pushed away from the hobby entirely. So there are plenty of moderate white folks who, when they hear me speak, and I'll own this, in sweeping categories, right? Whiteness, white culture, and white supremacy, and racism is everywhere. America is racist. Gaming is racist. Da 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 da. Or these games are racist, and so therefore, if you like those games, you must be a racist. So it's almost like there's a person, and then there's this big pyramid, and when we talk this way, we're ascribing the entire system of the pyramid to this one person. You believe that. That's your mentality. All white people are that. And therefore, because of that judgment, we're going to try to exclude you. That's a huge fear. So let me address this particular fear. I think so much of our culture where what goes wrong when two people of goodwill speak, this is where things kind of go haywire a little bit. Okay. Number one, I think there's a logical fallacy at play. Everywhere does not equal everyone. The statement, America is racist, does not mean everyone in America or everyone who loves America is racist. Those are not the same thing. Trees are everywhere in America. That does not mean everyone in America is a tree. Pollen is all over the place. I just took my kid to the park, sneezed my butt off. I got some bad allergies. I still can't say that everything and everyone in the park is pollen. When POC speak, we tend to speak in these broad categories. It's how we think. We think in ecosystems. We think in systems. We think in terms of the structures and the founding documents and organizations and all that stuff. And the passes through a filter where so many folks take that personal and they say, you're calling me this thing. It's not true. It's just not. The fallacy is pretty deep. I could say right now, most of the people I know, and definitely me, I don't want to implicate directly an individual person. If you're an American, that's awesome. Generally, I will have a default to think that every American, every white person is generally awesome. And especially if you're a gamer, you're my peoples. So that brings me to the second thing. I think there is skepticism about that. So it comes from the fact that I'm talking about these things at the same time. There's the person and there's the system and there's a relationship between the two. So the instinct is to assume that I'm talking about that as the same thing. I'm not talking about that as the same thing. I'll tell you exactly what I mean. It's not who you are and what you believe. It's more about what you tolerate in your spaces. That's so important. I'll say it again. It's not who you are or what you believe. It's what you tolerate in your spaces. Example. So let's say someone did some kind of comment and they got removed from a forum. Then they'll go to another space. They'll go to a friendly YouTube creator. They'll go to a private Discord, some other space that they know will be more supportive. And they express their grievance. And, chances are there'll be other people expressing their grievance. And that's kind of that first level of pyramid. They're expressing their hurt, their fear of being excluded, all that kind of stuff. There will be the occasional comment that rises up in the pyramid. It'll be a pushbacker comment or even a veiled racism comment. Of, all the SJWs are this and this person is this. There'll be personal insults. There'll be unkindness. There'll be aggression. And because they feel that person is defending them, that gets tolerated. And that is how the pyramid instantiates itself. When the bottom tolerates something a little bit up above, that little bit up above is allowed to grow. They go into their own spaces. They start to tolerate a little bit more, and then we get to the top. That is how it happens. It is a tolerance of this stuff. You're not racist, but how much racism are you tolerating? How much is being covered by whataboutism? How much is being covered by both sidesism? When I put that comment that I got on my channel, which was, all Saxons and whatever, and, if you don't love it, leave it. A lot of folks just went directly to, well, there's problems on both sides. That tolerates that kind of discourse, that tolerates that kind of statement. I'm not saying you believe it, but if you're not speaking against it, then it's allowed to take root, and that is how we get the growth in the pyramid. It's not what you believe, it's not who you are, it's about what you tolerate. So here is a follow-up pro tip. If you are a person who seems to be getting a bit of guff from the progressives or liberals, whatever you call that side, you're looking at yourself and going, I'm such a good person. I try very hard, believe in multiculturalism. I don't know why this is happening to me. Look around you. This pyramid, not only is it an exercise in laying out the different types of expressions of intolerance. That's what we're talking about at the end of the day, intolerance and instantiation of hierarchy. So I lay it out and also describe the process whereby we get from the bottom to the top. And really the mechanism, one of the key mechanisms anyway, amongst the very key ones, is what we tolerate. How in spaces, when we tolerate more and more exclusionary speech and actions, that is the slow buildup from the bottom to the top. And so, is that happening in your spaces? And that's a difficult thing because, I can say that and it sounds all beautiful and clinical and clean, but in the real world, it's become so much more difficult. Maybe it's a family member or a friend or a member of your gaming circle that's saying these, these things, and you've kind of established a category. It's like, oh, that person talks like that. That's just the way he is or she or whatever it is. Maybe you are influenced by free speech, right? I don't want to censor anybody. Everybody has free speech. They can say whatever they want. And okay, I believe in free speech too. Free speech, first of all, it's a government thing, and I don't think we're talking about government things. Second of all, it doesn't negate the fact that this dynamic could be at play. And okay, so that person has a free speech, but do they need to have intolerant free speech in your spaces? For me, my maxim is the only thing I don't tolerate is intolerance. I love it when people disagree and we have different perspectives, but when that disagreement reinstantiates hierarchy, I have a problem. I invite you to explore whether that problem exists in your spaces. And so that is my presentation of 7 steps, white replacement fear or white supremacy or whatever you want to call this material. I promised myself here on Shelf Stories this year that I would try to make sure the videos more compact. And here I am almost 50 minutes plus into a concept. But I sincerely hope that the material has been laid out, that there was enough in there to justify the treatment and that you learned and have something to move forward. And I'm going to introduce one more concept before I close this one out and move on. Because at the end of the day, I'm very interested, as I said in the beginning, in solutions. How do we move forward? I presented this whole thing. Now, how do we deconstruct it? I hope that I've laid some breadcrumbs towards that end along the way. And that specifically comes to that bottom 2 levels. This level of community. And I try to reframe things away from thinking of all this racism stuff as all hatred all the way down, and showing that the top is about those hatred expressions, but the bottom is about fear. And where does fear come from? For me, fear comes from a scarcity mindset. Fear of exclusion, well, the fear of exclusion comes from the idea that it's a limited space, that there's only so many games for people, only so many spaces available, only so many centers of power, and all, like scarcity up and down the system. And if new people are coming in, then that necessarily, like a full glass of water, splashes some things out. I want to totally rethink that. I want to get away from a scarcity mindset and talk about an abundance mindset, a multicultural mindset that emphasizes brotherhood and sisterhood, that emphasizes a place for everybody. In an abundance mindset, that fear can start to melt down a little bit. We can let our guard down a little bit, and we could start to really see each other and affirm that the name gamer is an inclusive word. In that mindset, we can start to pull out certain aspects of the pyramid, and without that base, the rest of it crumbles. Boy, that is a hopeful vision, but I sincerely believe in that vision. So now I got one more video to go. This one was pretty tough, went at some difficult topics. The next one, I'm going to describe an abundance mindset. I'm going to describe my vision of a truly multicultural world. I think that by articulating that positive vision, encapsulating this whole thing, we stand the best chance of bringing people along who might be locked in by fear and welcoming them and enlisting them away from the garbage toward something better. If you could change your mind, you could change the world, people. So until next time, later, everybody.